late October 1942. After the defeat suffered during the previous winter in front of Moscow, the German army seems to be on the verge of achieving all its objectives. In the north of the Eastern Front, Manstein is preparing the final assault on Leningrad. In the center, the Germans are holding on to the Rzhev Salient, just 150 kilometers from Moscow, which represents a significant threat to Stalin. On the southeastern front, where the 1942 summer offensive has been launched, Army Group South, divided into two, is just a few meters away from taking control of both Stalingrad and the main oil wells in the Caucasus. And finally, in North Africa, Erwin Rommel was in the vicinity of El Alamein, just 250 kilometers from Cairo. Thus, on the map, it seemed that the German army was just a few weeks away from definitively imposing itself on its enemies. However, in just a few days, all German dreams came crashing down in the worst possible way. In this program, we will analyze how Germany went from being on the verge of victory to being completely sentenced to death in just a few days. In chronological order, the first setback suffered by the German army took place in the vicinity of Leningrad. The recently promoted Field Marshal Manstein, who during the summer months had taken the fortress of Sevastopol, had been sent to Leningrad to take the city. However, Manstein had to face a strong attack that the Soviets launched in the sector, and when he was finally able to restore the situation on October 15th, his troops were very weakened. In short, he had to use the divisions that he had prepared to assault Leningrad to defend against the Soviet attack, and by the end of October, it was impossible for him to launch an attack on Leningrad. Although he requested new reinforcements, nothing could be sent to him. The standstill in front of Leningrad was the first setback suffered by the German army during the final phase of 1942, although it was undoubtedly the mildest of all those that were to come. It was only a few days later, far away, that the first event occurred that set off all the alarms in Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Stretching his supply line to the maximum, Rommel had managed to reach the vicinity of El Alamein at the beginning of the summer of 1942, and on the 1st of July, he launched an attack against the last British line of defense before reaching Alexandria. Although he managed to advance a few kilometers, Rommel's Afrika Korps was finally paralyzed in front of El Alamein by the end of July. From then on, the Italian and German divisions went on the defensive. After a few months of recovery, the British Army, led by Montgomery, launched an offensive against the Afrika Korps at the end of October 1942, with which they gradually managed to break the German defensive line. After heavy fighting during the previous days, late in the morning of November 4th, Rommel realized that his situation was desperate. On the evening of November 4th, Rommel wrote, "Powerful enemy armored forces have opened a 19-kilometer hole in our front, through which they are advancing westwards with strong tank corps. As a result, our forces in the north are threatened with being surrounded by enemy formations 20 times larger than ours. There are no reserves, as all available men and guns have been brought into the line of fire. So now what we had done everything possible to prevent has happened. Our front is crumbling, and the fully motorized enemy is charging towards our rear. Orders from above no longer count. We have to save everything we can." Rommel subsequently telegraphed Hitler for permission to withdraw westwards. At 17:30, unable to wait for a reply from Hitler, which was not forthcoming, and with his entire front crumbling by the moment, Rommel gave orders to withdraw. From here, the entire German line collapsed, and Rommel began to retreat ever faster towards Libya. There would never be another German advance toward Egypt. But as misfortunes never come alone, while this was taking place in the vicinity of El Alamein between November 8th and 16, the long-awaited American landing took place on the coasts of present-day Morocco, right in Rommel's rear. This put an end to any German hope of establishing a new front line as far east as possible. From here, there was no choice but to advance towards Tunisia so as not to be completely isolated. Thus, as if in the blink of an eye, and while Mussolini was preparing for his triumphal walk through Egypt, the German campaign in North Africa ended instantly. However, and fortunately for the Germans, the Allied advance towards Tunisia, both by the Americans who had landed in present-day Morocco and by the English who came from Egypt, was much slower than the Germans had expected. This gave the Germans time to mount a strong resistance in Tunisia that lasted until May 1943. Of all the setbacks suffered by the German army during the months of October and November 1942, the one that followed was undoubtedly the worst. The battle for the city of Stalingrad, which at first had been nothing more than a secondary objective, began in August 1942. Shortly before, Hitler had decided to divide Army Group South into two, resulting in the so-called Army Group A and Army Group B. Thus, while Army Group A advanced towards the Caucasus, Army Group B headed for Stalingrad. One of the factors that played against the Germans the most was their excessive self-confidence. This confidence was present throughout the 1941 campaign, in which they believed they would defeat the Soviet Union in just a few weeks. Although they did not succeed, the millions of casualties they inflicted on the Red Army during the final months of 1941 convinced them that the Soviet capacity to continue resisting was close to coming to an end. The new defeat they inflicted on the Soviets during the Second Battle of Kharkov and the subsequent advance they achieved towards the Caucasus made them again convinced that their Russian enemy was on the verge of collapse. However, by November 1942, the Soviets were far from defeated and were preparing the largest offensive they had yet undertaken. The German advance through the destroyed city of Stalingrad was much slower than expected and ended up completely stalling. Furthermore, during the fighting of the autumn months, the German Sixth Army was completely shattered. It was in mid-November, when Paulus was preparing for the final attack on the last Soviet redoubts in Stalingrad, that the Soviets began their great offensive. Known as Operation Uranus, it began on November 19th and ended just 4 days later, with some 330,000 Axis fighters surrounded in the vicinity of Stalingrad. From this point on, tension in Hitler's headquarters began to rise uncontrollably. Although just a few weeks ago everything seemed to be going well, and they believed that victory was within their grasp, by the end of November, all fronts were going through their worst crisis. A large part of the German reserves were being sent to Tunisia to hold that last position in North Africa, and little or nothing was left to send to rescue the soldiers trapped in Stalingrad. In addition, to aggravate the situation, the Soviets launched another powerful offensive against the German salient in Rzhev, which prevented Army Group Center from sending reinforcements to Stalingrad. The best units Germany had, those belonging to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, made up of the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, had already been urgently sent to the Eastern Front, but they would not be able to arrive in time to save the situation in Stalingrad. Although not as famous as Operation Uranus, the attack that the Soviets launched against the Rzhev Salient on November 25, 1942, was more powerful than the one they made in Stalingrad. By comparison, it should be noted that for the so-called Operation Mars against the Rzhev Salient, the Soviets had almost 2 million troops and 3,300 tanks. On the other hand, against Stalingrad, they used just over 1 million soldiers along with 1,500 tanks. However, General Walter Model's German Ninth Army was well prepared to withstand the Soviet onslaught and was able to hold its ground without losing much ground. However, due to the sheer scale of the Soviet attack, the German Army Group Center was severely weakened and unable to send reinforcements south. When the Southeastern Front finally collapsed in early January 1943, Model was forced to abandon the Rzhev Salient in order to cut the front line and free up troops to participate in the new summer offensive of 1943. The operation to withdraw from the Rzhev Salient was codenamed Operation Buffalo and took place during the month of March 1943. In short, the withdrawal was able to cut the front line by 370 kilometers and free up some 21 German divisions to be used for other tasks. On the negative side, any possible German advance on Moscow was forever cancelled. Well, this is how a German army that seemed to be going to achieve all its objectives at the end of 1942 suffered its biggest setback yet, and in just a few days everything turned against it. From here, they had to concentrate all their efforts again for a new offensive in the summer of 1943, which was known as Operation Citadel, while in the Mediterranean they lost Tunisia and Sicily. By the end of 1943, the situation of the German army on the Eastern Front was alarming, and the opening of a second front in northern France was imminent. So, what do you think about the events that took place at the end of 1942? Do you think that the Germans could have avoided these events?